Linguistics Behind the Scenes.
What you always wanted to know about language and how to explore it.
With Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer.
And Dominic Piazza. Christina, once upon a time, two linguistics nerds gathered to record another episode of their podcast.
Lo and behold, it was Linguistics Behind the Scenes. Hi, Dominic.
Hi. That was good. Yeah, Christina, as I've told you, I've been here in Europe. I've been trying to travel around. And when I went to Paris, I happened to pass by the Disneyland Paris. Have you ever been?
Oh, yes, I went there when I was still at school. We did an exchange and I was so happy to be going there because I had always wanted to go to Disney World. But of course, it was very far away in the United States. And it was just so exciting to finally be able to go and see the castle and all those, figures, those different characters from the Disney films and go on the different rides. It was just fantastic, yeah.
Oh yeah. I'm a big fan. I did not have a chance to go inside the park at Disneyland Paris, but I was outside in the front area of the park in the Disney Village, which is like the shopping area with the restaurants. Actually, in Disneyland in the US, that area is called Downtown Disney. I learned being here in Europe that apparently downtown is an American term. You'd be more likely to say city center?
Yeah. I would say so, yeah. Center. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I've been to the Disneyland in the Los Angeles area. It's actually in a city called Anaheim. It's about an hour outside of Los Angeles. I've been there several times. It was a little bit easier because I'm from California, but even then it was like an 8-hour drive. But I absolutely...
Wow.
Yeah, well, it's Disneyland. So you gotta... But I absolutely love Disneyland. Just a magical place.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what Disney stands for, right? I mean, this kind of fairy tale magic.
Yes. It's all about escapism in a way. When you enter Disneyland, at least in the US, maybe at the other parks, there's a plaque right above the doorway. And it says, "Here you leave today and enter the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy."
Oh, that's beautiful.
And of course, Disney, I would say really the foundation of Disney going back to the early films, the early cartoons, well, aside from Mickey Mouse, were very heavily based on classical fairy tales, right? Like Cinderella, Snow White.
Oh yeah, particularly Snow White, because that was the first feature film that Disney made. Mm-hmm. And it was quite spectacular at the time because, of course, it also used music. So the musical score was also quite a success. And it was a complete film and people were very fond of all those different characters. And while the film didn't really get an Academy Award, an Oscar, the following year, he was presented with an honorary one and 7 small ones, which I think is so cute.
Ooh, very nice. Very nice. Yeah, Snow White, the original from 1937, it's so important because I don't think it was the first feature-length animated film, but it was certainly the most prominent to have an entire movie being animated. And of course, back then it must have been so much work because it had to be hand-drawn. I have a lot of respect for that. And I think it's so cool how Disney in the early days drew from these collective human stories, which were just out there in the public domain. Anybody can work with them and retell them.
Yeah, that's the thing. And it's always been like that because the fairy tales, I mean, now that we think of the fairy tales, for example, by the Brothers Grimm, we might say, okay, do you know the fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm? But then, I mean, there's not just one version. I mean, they went through a process of re-editing. And of course, the fairy tales themselves, they go further back and they have been told in very different versions around the fireplace. At least that's like the traditional idea. So people telling each other those stories and also, modifying them ever so slightly as they pass them on from one person to the next.
Yeah, that is the problem when writing down these sort of oral histories or oral traditions. I think actually Homer's The Odyssey is a similar situation where that was actually like an oral story that had been passed down and he was just the one to finally write it down and compile it. We kind of attribute it to him, but he's not really the author, so to speak.
Yeah, it's the same thing with the fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm. So Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm lived in the 19th century in Germany. And, well, by the way, they were linguists. Did you know that? That's so cool. So they wrote a very, very important dictionary. And they also found out about sound laws, how the European languages are connected to each other and ultimately go back to Indo-European. Really cool stuff. But what they also wanted to do is they felt that they were living at a time, when industrialization was starting, and they had the impression that people were stopping to tell each other fairy tales around the fireplace. And so they thought, it would be really important to document these before they die out. And so they just collected them, and supposedly they went into the countryside and had people tell them to them, so the farmers. But actually, there's also quite a lot of ladies that lived in the cities who also knew a lot of stories and then told them these stories as well. So they collected them from different people. They wrote them down and, published them in book form. And now they are such an important part of cultural heritage.
Yeah, that's field work. That is field work. You have to go out into the field and interview people and collect data. And yeah, I would assume that every single time you ask someone to tell you this story, certain details are going to be different, right? So, and that's actually why for many of these fairy tales, we do have different versions. So I'm wondering how they kind of accounted for that to kind of try and develop the most neutral version of the fairy tale.
That's a really good question. I don't think they wanted to do that. They wrote down the stories as they were told to them. At least that's what they say in the introduction. And so they didn't have the aim of trying to kind of capture all the different variation there, but they just wanted to write down the version that they were told. And you're right. I mean, there's different versions. For example, for some of the fairy tales, there's a slightly different version that is also documented in France. So Charles Perrault, he was also a collector of fairy tales. And you also notice that, for example, in the German tradition, Cinderella is different from Cinderella in the, let's say, English tradition.
Yeah. I mean, because normally, we think of, Snow White as a German fairy tale, Cinderella is a French fairy tale, but in conversations that I've had with you outside of the podcast, I think you've stressed to me that really these fairy tales go so far back that trying to apply these kind of modern nationalities to them is probably not the right call.
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, it seems that these ladies that the Brothers Grimm also had among the people telling them fairy tales, they had also partly heard French fairy tales.
Yeah.
I mean, what's German, what's French, It's a kind of joint heritage in a certain way anyway.
Yeah.
And there are these differences between the versions that you notice, for example, when you compare the version by the Brothers Grimm that is read to German children in kindergarten, and in which Cinderella actually gets the dresses that she needs in order to go to the ball and to win the prince's heart. So she gets those from a little tree on her mother's grave and from a little bird. But of course, I think most people will know the Disney film version, which is the version that is from France and that is also very common in the English-speaking world, and where you have a fairy godmother who turns pumpkins into a carriage, and then you get, the mice that turn into horses, etc.
Oh, yeah. And when it comes to the Disney films, to the Disney versions, I really like them, but they are certainly sanitized and child-friendly, family-friendly, because when you actually read some of the originals of some of the fairy tales, they are quite dark and sometimes quite violent.
They are. And this is something that you may not necessarily have considered, because when you present them to children, you usually give them this kind of, as you called it, sanitized version, which is less gory. But the original fairy tales were quite violent. And I mean, there's still quite a lot of violence in there if you come to think about it. I mean, think about Hansel and Gretel. Or is that how you would call it? Hansel and Gretel?
Yep, that's right. And we know that one. Yeah, I think that one still makes the rounds in the English-speaking world.
I mean, sending your children into the forest in order to try and get rid of them, and a witch trying to eat the children, and the children pushing the witch into the oven. I mean, there's quite a lot of violence in that fairy tale as well, even in the version that children are told. Probably that's why there's no Disney version of Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah, there's really no way to sanitize that one. What are you going to do with the witch? Yeah, that is true. That is true. Christina, we've actually, for a while now, we've been working on a project with Grimm's fairy tales, and we can't reveal too much here, but at least what I can tell you is that I've actually had to read a lot of these fairy tales, and so I've been learning a lot about them, and yeah, they can be quite dark, quite violent, but the great thing about the fairy tale world is that the laws, the rules of reality do not apply, and so sometimes when a person is killed or hurt, it can be magically undone.
Exactly. That's what happens very often. And I mean, in the end, usually everything turns out well, at least for the heroes of the story, for the good guys, you know? And that's what we all want. Don't we want that? I mean, like that in the end, everything turns out well.
Yes. They all lived happily ever after. That's
exactly. Yeah, and I mean the project that you just mentioned, this Transgrim project, that's a really large project. So we're collecting the fairy tales, and we are formatting them in such a way that we can automatically analyze them. And so there's a lot of different topics that we're currently preparing for research, linguistic research on the fairy tales. But I have also carried out some research on fairy tales in the past.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the compendium of fairy tales is so much larger than people might think, because I think in terms of, I mean, it's hard to generalize, but I think in terms of popular fairy tales that still make the rounds, maybe it's a group of 10 or 20, but there are hundreds of fairy tales.
Yeah. I mean, like, what fairy tales would you say are the best known fairy tales in the US? Like, what are the ones that you probably encountered?
Yeah, hard to generalize. Well, aside from the Disney ones, which I'll put aside, you know, we have Little Red Riding Hood, we have Hansel and Gretel, we have The Boy Who Cried Wolf, we have Goldilocks, but I don't think all of these relate to the Brothers Grimm. They're not German, are they?
No. I mean, take Goldilocks, for example. I mean, Goldilocks is definitely not in the Brothers Grimm. I mean, I'm aware of Goldilocks. It's a very, very nice little fairy tale about a little girl who, she gets into a house, and 3 bears are living in there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a very cherished tale, isn't it, Dominic?
Very cherished, yeah, and it actually extends into the language. So, for example, we have the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. And actually, they say in astronomy, they say that the Earth is in a Goldilocks zone in terms of its distance from the sun, that the temperature is just right. There's kind of a myth that it's exactly right, but it's actually a zone, which is just right. And we are in that Goldilocks zone. So I like it, very illustrative.
Yeah, and I mean, Goldilocks, I mean, is one of those fairy tales that are very common in the English-speaking world, just like Jack and the Beanstalk, for example.
I know that. Yeah, very familiar with that one too. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, they're not part of the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, but, I mean, the Brothers Grimm collected a lot of fairy tales. So altogether, you have 200 fairy tales in the version of the book that is most famous, the edition from 1857. And there's also a lot of fairy tales that people don't know about. There's fairy tales like, for example, the White Snake, in which if you eat a certain white snake, then you can speak the language of animals, which I think is a very nice idea.
Almost reminds me of the parcel tongue from Harry Potter.
Oh, right. Yeah, but in that case, it's not just like talking to snakes,
That's
but
true.
You can talk to all animals.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
And the nice thing, of course, is that then the animals, they also cooperate with you. That's also a very nice thing. Well, I mean, the fairy tales, they typically also teach us something. And in that case, it's that, well, animals can be kind and that we should also be kind to animals, you know?
That's true. The moral of the story, right? Usually I associate fairy tales with having a moral. That's one of the reasons why you tell them to children, is because you're trying to teach them something. I mean, or maybe just entertain, but I always thought of fairy tales as containing a moral or a lesson that you're trying to teach.
Yeah, I would also say so. I think the fairy tales traditionally have morals such as, for example, treat others respectfully. I mean, there's a lot of fairy tales which revolve around people who are not what they seem at first sight. They're typically some kind of magical creature. And if they are not treated in a polite way by, well, one of the main characters of the story, in the end, it will not do them any good, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And you mentioned just a moment ago, you mentioned the 1857 edition, because, something important here is that the Brothers Grimm were German. And so when they documented the fairy tales, of course, they were doing it in German. So that means that in order for the rest of the world to read these and enjoy these, they need to be translated. And translating fairy tales is quite an endeavor.
It is, but it's definitely worthwhile, I would say, because, I mean, you also encountered the fairy tales as a child, at least some of them, like Hansel and Gretel. And I suppose you never wondered, like, oh, is this a German story? Or was it presented to you as a German story?
Not that I can remember. But I could tell that it took place. I could tell that it took place in some kind of a fantastical past. It didn't take place in the modern world.
No, definitely not. I mean, that's a typical characteristic of fairy tales, that it's some kind of imagined faraway past where magic is normal. And I mean, you have all those talking animals and magical objects and things that are happening that wouldn't happen in real life. But no one wonders about that. You know, no one is surprised that, for example, you have a little pot, and if you speak a few magical words, then all of a sudden it's going to produce a lot of food. And I mean, again, I mean, that's also one of those little stories that show you shouldn't be greedy, because you shouldn't overuse it, because otherwise in the end it produces too much food and you can't go back into your house.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it would be fun. It would be fun to like compile a list of all of the morals from each fairy tale and try to find which one is the funniest or the most unique. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, like the fairy tales, they have these central messages that I think a lot of people all over the world can identify with somehow. I mean, there's different oral narratives in different cultures, but somehow the fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm, well, managed to be received, to be read all over the world. And actually, they have been translated in over 160 languages. Would you believe it?
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, 160 languages. I wasn't expecting the number to be that large, but yeah, definitely. I mean, these stories are very European. I mean, frequently they feature knights and kings and castles and princesses and all of these very European features, I would say. But I would hope that the lessons they teach could be universal in a way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would assume so to a certain extent, but then of course I come from Germany and that is the place where they originate. Yeah. So I might be a bit biased, but I have to say, I mean, there's 160 languages. I'm a linguist. I don't think that I could name 160 different languages, even if I tried. But of course, it makes them so important. So I think it's one of the books that has been printed most all over the world, next to the Bible.
Yeah. Or maybe Shakespeare as well.
Oh, Shakespeare. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Shakespeare presumably as well. Yeah. Even though, of course, Shakespeare is also very often performed. So I don't know how often people read it. I read Shakespeare, but...
They made us read it in school. much to the chagrin of students because they struggle to understand it. But
well, I have to admit that I also read it while in school, but I read it just for fun because I had watched Much Ado About Nothing and I really loved that. So I wanted to also read Shakespeare in the original with the German translation, and I really enjoyed it very much because it had such a beautiful language, just like the fairy tales. It's also a very special kind of language, a special kind of style. And of course, if you translate, then you also have to make sure that you capture that somehow. And that is a topic that I'm very interested in as a linguist. And this is, of course, a direction into which we're going with the resources that we're currently compiling.
Yeah. So with Shakespeare, for example, you can get a modern English translation or even a bilingual version where it's the original on one side and modern English on the other side. But in general, I think you'll find teachers will really heavily discourage this. They don't want you reading the modern English translation because while it might be easier to understand, it's just not. It's not the same. It doesn't capture the same essence. And so I would assume that this applies across languages when you're trying to translate these very stylized, fantastical fairy tales or these fantastical plays from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, so I still feel it's very nice to read the fairy tales in the original version. And when I say original here, I mean the edition that is now typically considered the original is actually the 7th version that the Brothers Grimm produced themselves. Yeah. Because in the beginning, when they first collected the fairy tales, I mean, when they first printed them in 1812, 1815, I mean, that edition changed considerably over time. And I once looked at the differences between the first and the last edition, and I noticed that at least for the passage that I looked at, I think almost half the words in the passage had been changed or had been added. So they did change them a lot. And the interesting thing is that they did so because they also wanted to make them more suitable for children. So I suppose for modern tastes, as we discussed earlier, I mean, they're quite violent to some extent, but still, I mean, there's a lot of kind of very important things that happen in the fairy tales that are about how you develop as a person, how you grow. They have a lot of, I would say important content that helps children also handle emotions that they have and come to grips with difficult situations that they might experience. It helps them kind of, deal with the world.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And you can imagine over the centuries, sitting around a fire and sharing these stories. Yeah, certainly meant to entertain, but also meant to teach. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Dominic, are you familiar with UNESCO World Heritage Sites?
Oh yeah. I've been visiting a lot of them here in Europe. We do have some in the US. It seems that most of ours are like national parks and things like that. But here in Europe, a lot of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites are like man-made constructions and things like that.
I really love World Heritage Sites as well, because when I visit other countries, I usually try to find out what World Heritage Sites are there, and then I visit those. And I mean, they usually turn out to be extremely impressive. So it's usually a very good choice.
Yeah. It's a very special distinction.
Exactly. And the thing is that this also exists at a documentary level. So in 2005, the Grimm's fairy tales were recognized as UNESCO World Documentary Heritage. And I think that really testifies to their importance for the whole world.
Yeah, nice. It's it makes sense with these fairy tales have been passed down for so long. They've become such an integral part of our kind of collective canon, at least in the West, but maybe actually all around the world at this point, because they've had such an immense reach. It makes sense to me that they should be honored as part of our world heritage. Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a very famous American scholar, Jack Zipes, who, he's published lots of research on fairy tales, and he's actually also translated the fairy tales into English. And he said that the Grimm's fairy tales are a treasure that belongs not only to Germany, but also to many other countries in the world. And I think he's so right about that. And that's why translating is so important. And would you believe that the very first translation of the fairy tales was into English?
Oh, into English first. Okay. Oh.
Yeah. And I mean, it happened very soon after the original fairy tales had been published in German by the Brothers Grimm. So as early as 1823. That's just, about 10 years later, which is really very, very early.
That is fast, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't the complete fairy tales, but a selection. And that was done by someone called Edgar Taylor. And of course, I mean, the fairy tales are a very special type of text. I mean, they have this very special magical atmosphere. And of course, it's also very important to capture that when you translate. And I think he did a really good job at that.
Yeah, undoubtedly. We spoke on a previous episode about translation. We talked about translating a dialogue, subtitles for Abana Or, a Holocaust survivor. In that instance, we were, you were translating speech, nonfiction speech, and that is very difficult. But I would think that translating fiction is maybe even more difficult because fiction is really a work of art. It's very stylistic, and you have to find a way to capture that in a different language. And more of an art than a science. I would think that's really hard.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's basically the highest level of translation that you can achieve, I would say, because in addition to the content, which you should always try and, reproduce accurately in such a way that everything that is important is included and that, everything has been covered in the correct order and things like that. You also want to capture the essence of it. And I mean, if I think of the German fairy tales, when I read them, I mean, they really evoke that magical world inside me. Mm-hmm. And of course, as a translator, you also want to achieve that. And I have to say, when you look at the translations into other languages, it's actually really good. So when I was still in school, I was in a French drama group, and we wanted to do a play on Snow White. And so I actually wrote that with a bit of help from my teacher. And to do that, I had the French translation of the fairy tale. And I was really impressed by the poetic language. And I thought, wow, apparently it is possible to also evoke those feelings in another language. And this is my personal journey there. But of course, Edgar Taylor came a lot earlier. And may I just kind of read 2 sentences to you?
Yes. I wanted to ask you about this because you can read the original German and then you could read an English or a French translation. And so I'd like to hear about this.
Okay, here it comes. Bald darauf bekam sie ein Töchterlein, das war so weiß wie Schnee, so rot wie Blut und so schwarzhaarig wie Ebenholz und war darum das Schneewittchen, Schneeweißchen genannt. Which is interesting because here, I mean, the name is Schneewittchen and not Schneewittchen. And you will notice that there's also a difference in the name that Edgar Taylor uses in this translation of the same passage. And so the little girl grew up. Her skin was as white as snow, her cheeks as rosy as the blood, and her hair as black as ebony. And she was called Snowdrop.
Yeah, it does sound very poetic. I mean, of course, the vivid descriptions of the colors, but also the repetition in the structure of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, repetition is a very, very important feature of fairy tales in general. Mm-hmm. I mean, not just of the language, but also of the narrative. But of course, these two go hand in hand because it's the language that, represents, that realizes the narrative. And the interesting thing is that the Brothers Grimm actually wrote several letters to Edgar Taylor, the translator of the Grimm's fairy tales into English, and they told him that they really liked his translation. So apparently they were able to read English, and they said that it read very, very well, and that they also found the style very appropriate for children, possibly even better than the kind of standard High German that people might use in other contexts. So it's very interesting to see that they discussed the style of their own fairy tale collection with the English translator, and then Wilhelm Grimm went on to develop this very characteristic fairy tale style through the 7 editions up until the last one, which is the one that we now know so much.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, because they were contemporaries, which, that's not always the case, right? You could be translating something 100 years, 200 years after the original author lived. So that is really cool. And we know that at least that Taylor's translation had the original author's blessing.
Exactly. And of course, they have been translated so many times, also into English, and the translations must necessarily vary in their quality. And of course, in a study that I once did on the translation of the style of the fairy tales into English and how that can be measured, I wanted to find out how well the different translations of Snow White actually captured that. And in order to determine which is a really good translation, I could just have said, oh, that's the one I like best, or I could just have used my measures and then see what turns out. But what would that give me, So I had to find out what is the best possible translation. What would you do in order to find that out, Dominic?
Oh, that is so tough. Yeah, because if you just gave kind of your opinion, it's kind of arbitrary. It's not so scientific, is it? This is art. How do you scientifically judge art when it comes to translation? I guess I would want to see, which does it contain all the details? Are details left out? Of course, it's okay to leave out some small details when translating, but you don't want to leave out the really important ones. That is so difficult. Yeah, maybe how much of the original it captures in terms of content, and then how well it captures the feeling. But I have no idea how you can scientifically measure feeling. It's so like personal. It's so human.
Yeah. There are some ways of doing so, but I think we need to talk about those some other time. Okay. But of course, in this context, as you said, it's such a subjective decision, and so a thing that we often do when it comes to subjective decisions is that we try and ask a lot of people. We try not to look at our own evaluation, but we try to see how others evaluate something, and then we try to find out what the most popular one would be in this case. And there's actually an American book from 1916 for which the authors asked library experts in children's literature and professional storytellers which they thought were the best English translations of the Grimm's fairy tales. And they determined that the translations by Lucy Crane, by Mrs. Edgar Lucas, and by Marian Edwards were particularly good. And what they then did is that they selected the best among these fairy tales for each of the specific fairy tales. And in that case, I knew which the version was, which a lot of experts on fairy tales thought was a particularly good translation. And so I was able to just apply my measures and see if my measures would manage to represent that well.
Nice. Very, very nice. Very, very nice. So people have been trying, when it comes to translating these fairy tales, they've been trying to, for quite a long time, evaluate kind of what is the best translation. Yeah, really fascinating stuff. I would, as an outsider, I would have no idea how to approach this. So now that was more than 100 years ago. But today, in the modern day, what kind of measures did you use to try and evaluate this?
I carried out some research about fairy tales that I presented at a conference which was dealing with combinations of words. And so I tested different measures in order to see if, by using those, I would arrive at the best ranked fairy tale version from those children's literature experts. And it's n-grams that actually worked best.
Oh, okay, wow, an academic conference. Yeah, in the world of literature and linguistics, fairy tales are very serious business. But an n-gram, what is an n-gram?
N-gram just means that you have n words in a row, and n can be a number. So you can have 2 grams, 3 grams, and 6 grams. So 2 grams basically means you divide up a sentence into chunks of 2 words. So if you take the Beatles song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, then 2 grams would be I want to hold your, and your hand. And you could also make 3 grams. I want to hold your, and hold your hand.
Okay, so the n is like a mathematical variable, like
Exactly.
x. I see.
Exactly. And I mean, if you had a 1 gram, that would be each word separated by spaces on its own. And if you, in this case, had a 6 gram, the 6 gram would be I want to hold your hand. So that's the complete title. So the 1 grams, well, I mean, that's just the individual words. They're not going to tell you very much about a text. And the 6 grams are going to be highly specific. So, I mean, you can basically have an n-gram that captures the whole text in once. But of course, that just applies to this particular text. So if you want to kind of find a meaningful grouping, you want to have something intermediate, and so I checked out the 3 grams. So I just split up the texts into groups of 3, and then I looked at the most frequent 3 grams and I marked them in different colors, and then I compared them with each other, and this actually worked very well. So by using those combinations of 3 words, I was able to actually determine quite well which version, which English translation captured the style particularly well.
Nice, Christina. Nice. Yeah. I feel like people might not expect that you can conduct such a scientific and critical analysis of something like a fairy tale. But I think this kind of highlights what we've mentioned before in the world of research, that, you really, as long as you can find an interesting or unique angle, you can research anything you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basically, you can. Of course, it always depends on whether you have the time and the funding to do it.
Logistics, yeah.
Logistics, yeah, and also, I mean, people who can help you with it. But ultimately, yes. And I mean, there's a lot of interesting things that can be done research on in linguistics, and so I hope there's more to come in the coming years. So we're currently preparing the ground. We're currently also developing software that allows us to analyze certain things automatically. Well, and I hope to talk more about that in the coming years.
Yes, watch this space, as they say in the industry.
Yes, indeed. And well, I think with this, we've reached the happy ending of our podcast.
Oh, yeah, we have. And hopefully both you and I and our audience can live happily ever after.
Oh, very nice, very nice. So stay curious, everyone out there. Have fun with language.
And join us next time on Linguistics Behind the Scenes.